Chapter 1. A Touch of Silence. The worn wood of the mop handle felt like an old friend in Ava's hands. Familiar. Solid. It was a comfort in the vastness of the midnight moon pack hall, a cavern of polished floors and vaulted ceilings that always seemed to echo with sounds she wished she couldn't feel. She moved in a practiced rhythm. Dip, ring, glide. Her reflection a colorless ghost on the gleaming surface. Her goal was simple, because it had to be. Disappear into the work. Become another shadow on the wall. The clatter of plates and the low rumble of conversation were just noise, a barrier she kept carefully in place. Suddenly, a sharp cry sliced through the drone. A tiny pup, no older than 4, had tripped over his own feet, his tumbling journey ending with a hard smack on the floorboards. His wail wasn't just sound. It was a hot, sharp spike of pain and surprise that jabbed directly into Ava's chest. She flinched, her knuckles whitening on the mop. A few warriors at a nearby table grumbled. One she-wolf shot an annoyed glare at the child's mother, who was trying to hush him. "Can't you keep him quiet?" the woman hissed, her irritation a bitter wave that rolled across the room. The pup's cries intensified, a storm of terror and hurt. He wasn't just loud. He was broadcasting his misery, and Ava was the only one with an open receiver. Forgetting her mission to remain invisible, she moved. Her feet carried her across the floor without a command, her body acting on an instinct older than thought. She knelt beside the weeping child, her worn gray dress pooling on the wood. She didn't speak. Words were useless things, clumsy and loud. Instead, she placed a hand on the small of his back. The effect was instant, utter. The torrent of screaming just stopped. It was as if someone had slammed a door on a hurricane. The pup's hiccuping sobs ceased, his small body going still beneath her palm. He looked up, his tear-streaked face a mask of pure confusion. The pain was gone, the fear sealed away behind a wall he couldn't see. A calm, glassy peace settled over him. Ava felt the stolen misery swirl inside her, a familiar, bitter poison she swallowed down. She absorbed it, because that was her purpose. That was her curse. To be a container for the pain of others. The child's mother stared, her mouth slightly agape. "How did you—" Ava pulled her hand back as if burned, the connection severed. She rose to her feet, her expression a careful, practiced blank. She offered no explanation, no smile. She couldn't. Showing any emotion was like opening a floodgate. The whispering started then, a venomous little trickle that followed her everywhere. "See? So cold. The girl feels nothing. Just like her mother, that one. Empty." The words were lies, but they were the only truth the pack knew. They couldn't understand that to feel nothing on the outside, she had to feel everything on the inside. What did they know of being a silent grave for the feelings of an entire pack? Returning to her bucket, she picked up the mop. The brief, intense connection had left a tremor in her hands. She needed to get back to the rhythm, back to the silence. But as she turned, a shadow fell over her. Alpha Marcus stood there, his arms crossed over his massive chest, a cruel sneer twisting his lips. His eyes, cold chips of granite, raked over her with disdain. "Cleaning up messes, as usual," he drawled, his voice a low growl that promised violence. "It's all you're good for." The weight of his contempt was heavier than any pup's cry, a crushing force that threatened to splinter the fragile peace she had just reclaimed. Chapter 2. The Weight of Grief. Following that encounter, the air had grown thick with unspoken threats, a silent promise of future pain from Marcus. Now, standing under a sky the color of a fresh bruise, Ava felt a different kind of pressure. The entire pack's grief was a physical weight, a suffocating blanket woven from 100 different sorrows that threatened to drag her down into the cold earth beside her mother's grave. She stood perfectly still, her face a serene mask of stone, while the people around her wept openly. They thought her unfeeling. Stupid. They didn't know she was a dam, holding back the full force of their collective despair, and the cracks were beginning to show. Each sob from an elder, each tear from a warrior, each whimper from a child was another stone loaded onto her shoulders. It was a roaring, churning sea inside her, and she was a lone, silent island in the middle of it. She couldn't cry her own tears because she was already drowning in theirs. Her mother was gone. The thought was a single sharp icicle in the center of the raging storm, a point of pain that was hers and hers alone. But even that was buried, lost under the suffocating sorrow of the pack. They mourned the loss of a packmate. Ava mourned the only person who had ever understood the silence. The pack's elder, a stooped wolf named Silas, finished his eulogy, his voice cracking with emotion. The wave of sadness that followed his words was so intense Ava's knees nearly buckled. She locked them, focusing on the rough texture of the single white rose she held in her hand. Its thorns pricked her palm, a small, grounding pain in an ocean of overwhelming feeling. Is this how it would be forever? To be a silent vessel for emotions that were not hers, with no room left for her own? Then, Alpha Marcus stepped forward. He cleared his throat, his gaze sweeping over the crowd before it landed, with deliberate cruelty, on Ava. He didn't begin with a fond memory or a word of comfort. He began with an accusation. "We gather to mourn a sister," he started, his voice booming with false sincerity. "A woman who, despite her weaknesses, served this pack." His eyes narrowed on Ava. "It is a shame her only daughter cannot show the same respect, cannot even shed a single tear for the one who gave her life." A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. Heads turned, eyes, red-rimmed and judgmental, fixed on her. They saw her stillness and named it disrespect. They saw her blank face and called it cold. Marcus was painting his own picture, using their grief as his brush and her silence as his canvas. He was twisting her curse into a crime. Because he knew. He knew exactly what she was, what she could do. Her mother had told her to be careful, to never let him see the truth of her power. "He twists things, little bird," she had whispered just weeks ago, her voice thin as paper. "He turns beauty into a weapon." He continued, his words piling on more weight, more shame. "Some are born simple. They do not feel things as deeply as the rest of us. We should not judge her for what she lacks, but pity her." He was dismissing her, belittling her grief, and turning her into a pathetic creature in front of the entire pack. And the worst part? She couldn't fight back. To show the rage that was now coiling in her gut, to let the anguish for her mother finally break free, would unleash not just her own pain, but the crushing agony of everyone around her in a tidal wave that would flatten them all. So she stood there, a statue of stone, holding the weight of 100 broken hearts, while the Alpha slowly and deliberately broke her own. He was finishing his speech, a smug look of triumph on his face, when a new sound cut through the air. It wasn't the sound of weeping. It was the purr of a powerful engine, impossibly sleek and out of place, growing steadily closer. Chapter 3. The King and the Pedal. That sound, the low growl of an expensive engine, silenced the funeral. Every head turned. A long black car, polished to a mirror shine, glided to a stop on the dirt path just beyond the gathering. It was a machine of impossible luxury in their rustic, wild world. The pack held its collective breath, the air crackling with confusion and a dawning sense of awe. Marcus's smug expression faltered, his jaw tightening as a man in a sharp black suit emerged from the driver's side and opened the rear door. This was an interruption he had not planned, a variable he could not control. A man stepped out of the vehicle, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. He was tall, impossibly so, with broad shoulders that filled out a perfectly tailored black coat. His hair was the color of dark honey, and his face was all sharp angles and regal authority. But it was his eyes that held the pack captive. They were the color of molten gold, filled with an ancient power that made the air feel thin. This wasn't just an alpha. The raw, untamed energy rolling off him in waves was something far greater. It was the Alpha King, King Henry. The whispers started, no longer venomous but filled with shock and fear. Why was he here? What could the king of all packs possibly want with a small, unassuming territory like Midnight Moon? As this impossible man stood by his car, his golden gaze surveying the stunned crowd, something else happened. A single, luminous petal, glowing with a soft, silvery light, detached itself from a high branch of the sacred Luna tree that overlooked the gravesite. The ancient tree, a myth brought to life, was said to only bloom when destiny was at hand. The petal didn't fall. It drifted. It floated on a current only it could feel, dancing through the air in a slow, deliberate spiral, leaving a faint trail of light in its wake. It bypassed warriors and elders. It ignored the Alpha. It floated directly towards Ava. She stood frozen, the weight of the pack's grief momentarily forgotten, replaced by a paralyzing electric shock. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. She could see the delicate veins in the petal, the way the light pulsed from its core. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, but for the first time, their judgment meant nothing. All that existed was that impossible, glowing thing. It hovered for a moment before her face, and then, with a touch as light as a moth's wing, it settled in her dark hair, a star caught in midnight. Silence. Not the quiet of morning, but a deep, horrified, absolute stillness. The world had stopped. Marcus's face was a mask of disbelief, his complexion turning a sickly gray. This was a sign from the goddess herself, a mark of the highest favor, and it had chosen her, the simple girl, the unfeeling outcast, the maid. It was a refutation of everything he had just said, a divine mockery of his authority. King Henry's golden eyes, which had been sweeping the crowd, now locked onto the single point of light in Ava's hair. His regal composure cracked, a flicker of stunned confusion crossing his features. He ignored Alpha Marcus completely. He ignored the gasping crowd. He began to walk forward, his steps measured and purposeful, each footfall on the damp earth a drumbeat marking the end of Ava's old life. He walked a straight, unwavering line through the parted crowd of wolves, his gaze fixed on her. On the nobody who was now, impossibly marked by fate. Chapter 4. The King's Decree. The world narrowed to the space between Ava and the approaching king. Each step he took was a hammer blow against the fragile walls of her composure. The pack's grief, the funeral, Marcus's sneer, it all evaporated like mist, replaced by a singular paralyzing terror. He wasn't looking at anyone else. His golden eyes were fixed on her, an intense, burning focus that stripped away her invisibility and left her feeling raw and exposed. She wanted to run, to fade back into the shadows where she belonged, but her feet were rooted to the damp earth. This man was a predator of the highest order, and she was the rabbit caught in his stare. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could smell the crisp scent of pine and the electric crackle of ozone that clung to him like a second skin. He was even taller up close, a mountain of quiet power that blocked out the sky. For a long moment, he said nothing. He just looked at her, his gaze dropping to the glowing petal in her hair. A flicker of something, confusion, wonder, disbelief, crossed his regal features before being suppressed. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, resonant timbre that vibrated through the ground, through her bones and straight into her soul. "You," he said, the single word a verdict. "You are my Luna." The declaration was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a command that rearranged the stars in her sky. A collective gasp rippled through the pack behind them. The silence that followed was even louder, thick with shock and envy and a dozen other sharp emotions that pricked at Ava's skin. Her carefully constructed mask, the blank face she had worn for years, finally shattered. The terror she had been holding back flooded her, raw and pure. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trying to escape its cage. Luna? Her? The broken, silent girl who swallowed pain for a living? It was a mistake, a cruel joke. Without waiting for a reply she couldn't possibly give, Henry reached out and gently took her hand. His touch was warm, his fingers firm as they wrapped around hers. The contact sent a jolt through her, a current of energy that was both terrifying and strangely grounding. He started to lead her away from the gravesite, away from the life she knew. She stumbled after him, a puppet on a string. Over his shoulder, she saw the faces of her pack. She saw Marcus, his face a thunderous mask of fury and thwarted ambition. She saw the others, their expressions a mixture of awe and resentment. They were strangers now. In a single moment, she had become more of an outcast than ever before. He led her to the gleaming black car, the door held open by the silent driver. The interior was dark leather and polished wood, a cage of impossible luxury. As he guided her inside, she felt the last threads connecting her to her old life snap. The door closed with a soft, final thud, sealing her in with the impossible king and a destiny she never asked for. Chapter 5. A Cage of Gold. The car moved with a silent, fluid grace, eating up the miles of forest road. The world outside was a blur of green and brown, but inside the luxurious cabin, the silence was a living thing. It was thick and heavy, pressing in on Ava from all sides. She sat perfectly still, her hands clenched in her lap, her eyes fixed on the window. She was acutely aware of the man beside her. King Henry. He wasn't looking at her, but she could feel the heat of his presence, the sheer force of his power filling the small space. It was like being locked in a cage with a slumbering lion. Even in rest, the danger was palpable. After what felt like an eternity, he finally broke the quiet. "Are you happy?" he asked. His voice, so powerful moments before, was softer now, laced with a genuine, if confused, curiosity. The question was so absurd, so completely disconnected from the reality of her life, that a bubble of cold, hysterical laughter threatened to rise in her throat. Happy? Was a mouse happy when a hawk plucked it from a field? She turned her head slowly to look at him for the first time. His golden eyes were watching her, his handsome face a mask of polite inquiry. He saw the mark of the goddess. He saw a future queen. He saw a symbol. He did not see her. A tiny spark of defiance, an emotion she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years, ignited in the cold emptiness of her chest. She was tired of being a ghost. She was tired of being a reflection of other people's feelings. "What's the point in asking?" she replied, her voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the silence with the sharp edge of a razor. "You don't see me." Henry's polite expression faltered. A flicker of surprise, then irritation, crossed his face. He leaned back against the plush leather, his jaw tightening. It was clear he was not used to being spoken to this way. Kings were not challenged, especially not by dusty nobodies from backwater packs. He was the most powerful wolf in the world because he commanded respect, fear, and adoration everywhere he went. People fawned over him, they bowed to him, they fell over themselves to please him. But this strange, silent girl with a goddess-kissed petal in her hair just looked at him with empty eyes and told him he was blind. "I see what the goddess has chosen," he said, his voice clipped, the warmth gone. "The goddess chose a symbol," Ava countered, finding a strange strength in her own honesty. "You're not talking to a symbol, you're talking to me, but you haven't even asked my name." The truth of her words hung between them, a stark and uncomfortable accusation. He had claimed her, uprooted her entire life, and set her on a path to be his queen, all without knowing the first thing about her. The frustration rolling off him was a palpable force, a low thrum of agitation she could feel in her teeth. It was an unfamiliar sensation. Most people's emotions were simple: grief, anger, joy. His were a complex knot of kingly pride, genuine confusion, and wounded ego. Before he could respond, The car broke through the trees. Spread before them in a sun-drenched valley was a sight of breathtaking scale. A city, more than a pack, with golden-roofed buildings, wide, paved streets, and a magnificent castle of white stone at its heart. The Golden Heart Pack. Its size, its power, its sheer, overwhelming presence filled Ava with a wave of dread so profound it stole her breath. This wasn't a cage, it was a whole new world, one she was meant to help rule, and she had never felt so small. Chapter 6. The Heart of the Hostile. As the car glided through the ornate gates of the Golden Heart Pack, wolves stopped to stare. Hundreds of them. They lined the streets, their faces turning towards the king's vehicle with curiosity that quickly morphed into shock. Ava could feel their eyes on her, 1,000 points of pressure against the glass. Their collective thoughts and feelings were a sharp, overwhelming roar compared to the dull hum of her home pack. This was a place of power, ambition, and fierce pride. The emotions radiating from the crowd were sharp and analytical. Who is that? Why is she with the king? She looks like a servant. The judgment was immediate and absolute. The car came to a stop before the grand entrance of the central keep, a palace of white stone and gleaming gold. The moment the door opened, the full force of the pack's scrutiny hit Ava like a physical blow. She stepped out onto the pristine cobblestones, her simple, dark funeral dress a smudge of soot against the grandeur of her surroundings. Henry stood beside her, his presence a shield. But it wasn't enough. The hostility was a palpable thing, a cold wind that cut through her clothes and chilled her to the bone. They were not happy. Their king had returned not with a powerful Luna from a noble pack, but with her. A path cleared through the crowd. A woman strode forward, her bearing as regal as the king's. She was tall and slender, with hair the color of spun silver braided down her back, and eyes as pale and cold as a winter sky. Her white robes marked her as a healer, but there was no gentleness in her gaze. She stopped before Henry, her eyes flicking to Ava with a look of undisguised contempt before returning to her king. The petal in Ava's hair seemed to shrink under the woman's icy stare. "My king," the woman said, her voice clear and carrying, yet devoid of any warmth. She bowed her head a fraction of an inch, a gesture of respect that felt more like a challenge. "You have returned. We had heard rumors of a sign from the goddess." "They are not rumors, Lyra," Henry replied, his voice firm, a clear warning in his tone. "The sacred Luna tree has made its choice. This is Ava. She is our Luna." Lyra's gaze settled on Ava again, and this time it was heavy with a cold, clinical assessment. It felt as though she were peeling back Ava's skin, searching for a soul and finding it wanting. She saw the simple dress, the blank face, the way Ava stood slightly hunched, as if trying to make herself smaller. She saw weakness. Ava could feel the healer's disdain, a sharp, bitter emotion that tasted like frost. She was being weighed, measured, and dismissed in a matter of seconds. Then, turning her attention back to Henry but speaking for the entire silent pack to hear, Lyra posed her question. Her voice was soft, yet it carried the chilling finality of a death sentence. "Is this truly her?" she asked, a single silver eyebrow arched in disbelief. "The one chosen by the Luna tree?" The question hung in the air, a poisoned dart aimed straight at Ava's heart. It was a direct challenge to the goddess, to the king, and to Ava's very existence in this new, terrifying world. The entire pack was waiting, watching. Ava met the healer's cold, pale eyes, and for the first time since the petal fell, the terror inside her began to curdle into something else. Something hard and defiant. Something that felt dangerously like resolve. Chapter 7. A Gilded Cage. The room they gave her was not a room. It was a cavern of luxury, a place so vast and opulent it made her feel like a stray mouse in a treasure chest. Sunlight streamed through arched windows that stretched from the polished floor to the painted ceiling, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like tiny diamonds. A huge bed, draped in silks the color of cream, sat in the center of the space like a throne. The air smelled of roses and lemon polish, a scent so clean and artificial it made her long for the familiar smell of damp earth and wood smoke. This wasn't a home. It was a statement, a gilded cage to hold the king's new prize. Two young maids, their faces pale with fear, had shown her the way. They had scurried around, pointing out the wardrobe filled with beautiful dresses she would never wear, and the bathing chamber with its deep copper tub, all while refusing to meet her eyes. She could feel their terror, a nervous, skittering energy that made her own skin crawl. They had heard the rumors. The unfeeling girl chosen by the goddess. They looked at her and saw an omen, a disruption, something to be feared. Their reaction was just a grander version of her old life, confirming that even in a palace, she was still an outcast. She was utterly, completely alone. A short time later, a guard brought in her single, worn leather bag. It looked laughably small and pathetic sitting on the priceless silk rug. After he left, Ava knelt before it, her fingers tracing the scuffed, familiar patterns. It was the only piece of her old life she had left. Opening it, the faint, familiar scent of her mother's lavender sachets filled the air, a scent of home that was so poignant it felt like a punch to the gut. Her few simple dresses and a worn pair of boots were nestled inside. But underneath them was something else, a small tattered notebook bound in cracked leather. Her mother's journal. Ava's breath caught. Her mother had always been writing in it, her head bent in concentration, a secretive little smile on her face. Ava had assumed it was just recipes or daily thoughts. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. It felt warm, a final piece of her mother's presence. Tucked inside the front cover, almost falling out, was a neatly folded piece of paper that was clearly not her mother's handwriting. It was a note, scrawled in hurried, messy script. A name was written at the bottom. Caleb. A young warrior from her pack, a friend who had always been kind to her, one of the few who looked at her with sympathy instead of disdain. A cold dread trickled down her spine. Why would Caleb hide a note in her mother's private journal? Why hadn't he just given it to her? An unspoken sense of danger, a feeling of conspiracy and secrets. She clutched the notebook to her chest, the folded note a sharp, pressing secret against her heart. The lavish room, with its beautiful silks and golden light, suddenly felt cold and menacing. She had a feeling that whatever was written in that journal and on that small, hidden piece of paper held the real reason her world had been turned upside down. And she was terrified to find out what it was. Chapter 8. Instinct and Chaos. From the balcony of her gilded cage, Ava watched the training grounds below. Warriors, their bodies gleaming with sweat, moved in a brutal, elegant dance of combat. Grunts of effort and the thud of bodies hitting packed earth echoed in the clear afternoon air. At the center of it all was King Henry. He moved with a speed and fluid grace that was breathtaking, his power a tangible aura that set him apart from everyone else. He was a king in his element, a perfect warrior. Ava felt a million miles away, an observer watching a life she could never be a part of. She didn't belong here. What could she possibly offer these fierce, proud people? The controlled chaos of the training session suddenly splintered. A large, gray-furred wolf locked in a sparring match suddenly stiffened. A low, guttural growl ripped from his throat, a sound of pure madness that was nothing like the controlled aggression of the training. His eyes, they began to glow with a sick, feral red light. He had gone rogue. The madness, a rare but terrifying affliction, had claimed him. His opponent scrambled back, shouting a warning. "He's lost it! He's gone feral!" Chaos erupted. The rogue wolf, now a snarling beast of pure instinct, lunged. Not at the warrior he was fighting, but at the easiest target. A small pup, who had been watching his father train from the sidelines, shrieked in terror as the massive wolf charged him. The sound of the child's fear was a physical blow to Ava. It was a high-pitched, piercing needle of pure panic that shot straight into her mind, bypassing all her defenses. Warriors shouted and moved to intercept, but they were too slow. Lyra and another healer rushed forward, holding satchels of calming herbs, their faces grim. "Hold him back," Lyra commanded, but the rogue was a blur of teeth and fury. He was going to reach the child. The pup's terror escalated into a mind-shattering psychic scream, and in that moment, Ava's body moved on its own. She didn't think. She didn't plan. She simply reacted. She flew down the grand staircase, her feet barely touching the stone. She burst out onto the training grounds, a slim gray shadow moving with impossible speed. The warriors were a wall between her and the chaos, but she slipped through them like a ghost. She heard someone shout her name, Henry's voice sharp with alarm, but she didn't stop. The rogue wolf was almost upon the screaming pup. Just as its jaws were about to snap shut, Ava reached the child. She fell to her knees beside him and slammed her palm onto his small, trembling back. Just like with the crying pup in her old pack, the effect was absolute. The child's terror vanished, sealed. The psychic scream that had been driving the rogue into a frenzy was snuffed out like a candle flame. The pup fell silent, his body going limp with a sudden, unnatural calm. The rogue wolf skidded to a halt, its red eyes blinking in confusion. Its target was no longer afraid. The scent of terror was gone. That momentary hesitation was all the pack warriors needed. They descended on the confused beast, bringing it down in a tangle of bodies and nets. The entire training ground was silent, staring at her. They weren't looking at the subdued rogue. They were looking at Ava, the strange, quiet girl kneeling on the dirt. Lyra's face was a storm cloud of suspicion and disbelief. And then Henry was there, pulling her away from the stunned crowd, his grip like iron on her arm. He pulled her around to face him, his golden eyes burning with a new, frightening intensity. "What?" he demanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Did you do?" Chapter 9. The Ink of Truth. Back in the suffocating silence of her room, Henry's question echoed in her mind. "What did you do?" She didn't have an answer for him, or for herself. She had just acted. Now, with the adrenaline fading, a cold resolve settled in her bones. She was tired of not understanding, tired of being a pawn in a game she didn't know she was playing. She needed answers, not about the king or this new pack, but about her own life, about her mother. She walked over to her bag, pulled out the tattered notebook, and sat on the edge of the ridiculously large bed. Her hands were steady now. She was no longer afraid of what she might find. She needed to know. She opened the journal. Her mother's handwriting, a familiar, elegant script, filled the pages. At first, it was exactly what she expected. Notes on herbal remedies, observations about pack life, sketches of flowers. But as she flipped further, the tone began to change. The entries grew shorter, more fearful. Her mother's graceful script became tight, jagged. She wrote about Alpha Marcus, about his temper, his cruelty to the weaker members of the pack, the dark ambition that glittered in his eyes. "He speaks of the old ways," one entry read, "not of honor and spirit, but of raw, dark power. He is obsessed with stories the elders call forbidden. He searches for something." Ava's blood ran cold. She kept reading, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. Then she found the word, Shadowstone. Her mother had written it only once, the letters shaky, as if she were terrified to even put the name on paper. "Marcus believes the Shadowstone is real, a relic of immense corrupting power. He says it is the key to true alpha strength. The goddess preserve us if he ever finds it." Her hands trembling, Ava finally turned to the folded note from Caleb, which she had tucked into the last page. She carefully unfolded the thin, crinkled paper. His message was short, blunt, and utterly devastating. "Ava, I'm so sorry. There was no accident. He was with her by the river. I heard her scream. When I got there, he was walking away, and she was gone. He told the pack she slipped. He lied. He killed her. He said she was weak and stood in his way. He's planning something, Ava. Something terrible. He thinks no one knows. I put this here because he watches everyone. I hope this finds you. Be safe. Caleb. The world dissolved into a muted, soundless haze. He killed her. The words were a brand, searing themselves into her mind. The grief she had held back at the funeral, the vast collective sorrow of the pack, was nothing compared to this. This was a clean, sharp, all-consuming agony. The stoic mask she had worn for years didn't just crack, it disintegrated. A dry, ragged sob tore from her throat. Her mother hadn't just died. She had been murdered. Her kindness, her gentleness, had been seen as a weakness to be erased by a power-hungry monster. The grief burned through her, and in its ashes, something new and hard began to form. Rage, cold, pure, and absolute. The stakes were no longer about her fitting in or being the Luna. This was about justice, about vengeance. This was about the monster who was still leading her old pack, the man who had stolen her mother's life. She looked up from the note, her tear-filled eyes seeing not the luxury of the room around her, but the face of her enemy. She had a purpose now, a mission fueled by love and loss, but it was a truth so dangerous it could get her, and anyone she told, killed. She was trapped in the king's castle, and she had to decide if he was another part of her cage or the only key to her freedom. Chapter 10. Walls of Glass. The note from Caleb felt like it was burning a hole through the fabric of her dress. Every time Ava saw King Henry, the words screamed in her mind. He killed her. He's planning something. She knew she couldn't keep this secret. It was too big, too dangerous. This wasn't just about her mother anymore. It was about a corrupt alpha threatening the stability of the packs. She needed help. She needed the king. But when she finally found the courage to approach him in the grand book-lined study, the words caught in her throat. He stood by a massive window, a figure of intimidating authority, and her resolve crumbled. There is a problem. In my old pack, she began, her voice small and thin in the cavernous room. She clutched her hands together, a nervous habit she couldn't break. It's about Alpha Marcus. Henry turned from the window, his golden eyes patient but intense. A problem? What kind of problem? He was in his kingly mode, ready to assess a threat and deploy a solution. He was a commander waiting for a report. He's cruel, she stammered, the word feeling ridiculously inadequate. How could she explain the depth of Marcus's darkness? He hurts people. He's looking for something dangerous. She couldn't bring herself to say murder. The word was too sharp, too final. Admitting it out loud would make it real in a way she wasn't ready for. And what if he didn't believe her? A maid's word against an alpha's. Ava, I need more than that, he said, his voice firm but not unkind. He took a step closer. I can't act on vague feelings. Do you have proof? Witnesses? He was trying to help, she knew that. He was trying to be a leader. But every logical question he asked felt like a brick being placed in the wall between them. She didn't need a king to analyze a threat. She needed a partner to believe her when she was terrified. It's not that simple, she whispered, looking down at the floor. The shame and fear were a gag in her mouth. She was failing. She was failing her mother. Henry's patience began to fray. A flicker of frustration crossed his face. Then make it simple. You come to me with shadows and secrets, but you won't give me anything to fight. What do you expect me to do? He asked, his voice rising. I am trying to break through the walls you've built around yourself, but you won't give me a single crack to hold on to. His words hit her like a slap. His frustration? He thought she was the one with walls? You hide behind your crown just as much as I hide behind my silence, she shot back, her own frustration finally boiling over. You don't want a partner. You want a subject, someone to command. That's not true, he thundered, his kingly authority flaring into raw anger. He was a man used to being obeyed, and her quiet defiance was a challenge he didn't know how to meet. The emotional distance between them was now a physical chasm, crackling with misunderstanding and resentment. He stared at her for a long, tense moment, his jaw clenched, his golden eyes blazing. Then, with a low growl of pure frustration, he turned on his heel and stormed out of the room, leaving her alone with the echoing silence and her terrible unspoken truth. Later that evening, she saw him from her balcony. He was on the training grounds, a lone figure under the pale moon. He wasn't training. He was punishing a thick wooden practice dummy, striking it again and again with a savage, uncontrolled fury. It wasn't the controlled grace she'd seen before. This was rage. This was pain. And as she watched him, she realized with a sinking heart that his gilded cage was just as lonely and suffocating as her own. Chapter 11. The King's Ruin. A strange, empathetic pull drew her from the balcony. The sight of Henry's raw despair had resonated with a part of her soul that recognized a fellow prisoner. She moved through the silent corridors of the keep, a ghost in the moonlight, following the faint echo of his pain. She found him not in the throne room or the study, but in a small private armory off the training grounds. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar. Peeking inside, the scene stole her breath. Swords were knocked from their racks. A dented shield lay discarded in a corner. The air was thick with the scent of sweat and sorrow, and in the center of the chaos was the king, or what was left of him. He was on the floor, his back slumped against a stone wall, his head buried in his hands. His magnificent shoulders, which seemed capable of carrying the weight of the world, were shaking with silent, racking sobs. The unassailable Alpha King was gone. In his place was a man utterly and completely broken. The sound of his grief was a silent scream she felt in her own chest. This was a pain far deeper than simple frustration. This was the agony of a soul tearing itself apart. All her fear, all her hesitation vanished. This, she understood. This was a burden too heavy to carry alone. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the stone floor. He didn't look up. He was lost in his own personal hell. She knelt in front of him, the cold of the stone seeping through her simple dress. She didn't know what to say, so she did the only thing she knew how to do. She reached out and gently placed her hand on his. The moment their skin touched, a hurricane of emotions slammed into her. It was a torrent of feeling so violent it almost knocked her backwards. Crushing guilt, icy, gut-wrenching fear. A profound, aching loneliness that stretched back for years. It was the weight of a stolen crown, the ghost of a dead brother, the terror of being a fraud. It flooded into her, a poison she willingly accepted, sealing it away inside the empty chambers of her heart. Henry's head snapped up, his breath hitching in a shocked gasp. The torment vanished from his golden eyes, replaced by a stunning, peaceful emptiness. The sobs stopped. He stared at his hand, then at her, his face a mask of utter disbelief. The crushing weight he had carried for years was gone. In that moment of raw, shared vulnerability, with the truth screaming between them in the silence, his own walls crumbled to dust. "I'm an imposter," he whispered, the words ragged, broken. "I was never meant to be king." The confession spilled out of him, a torrent of buried pain. He told her about his older brother, Liam, the true heir, kind, strong, and born to rule. He spoke of a faked rogue attack years ago, a political assassination that had stolen his brother's life and thrust him onto a throne he never wanted. He confessed his deepest fear, that he was a fraud, a weak replacement, and that his lie of a reign had brought nothing but darkness. Ava listened, absorbing his words as she had absorbed his pain. And in his ruin, she found her own strength. He wasn't a king judging her. He was a broken man who understood the weight of a secret. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she finally let go of her own. "You're not the only one living a lie," she said, her voice clear and steady for the first time. "My mother didn't fall into a river, she was murdered, and the man who did it is coming for everything you hold dear." Chapter 12. Return to Midnight Moon. The ride back to the Midnight Moon pack was nothing like the first journey. The silence was no longer a suffocating void, but a space of shared purpose. Henry drove this time, his powerful car eating up the miles, and they spoke in low, focused tones. They were not a king and his chosen. They were two soldiers heading into battle. The weight of Caleb's note and her mother's journal sat in a satchel between them, a tangible representation of their mission. For the first time, Ava did not feel like a container for the world's pain. She felt like a weapon, honed and aimed. Her fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, protective resolve. She was going to get justice for her mother. When they arrived, the pack's reaction was immediate and chaotic. Wolves stopped their work, their heads snapping up as the king's car glided into the center of their territory. Their emotions were a tangled mess of confusion, awe, and a deep, simmering resentment that Ava could taste on the air. But this time, when she stepped out of the car, she did not flinch from their stares. She stood tall, Henry's solid presence a bastion at her side, and held her head high. She was no longer Ava the maid, the silent ghost who cleaned their floors. She was Ava, the chosen Luna, and she had returned to unearth their alpha's rotten secrets. They walked towards the great hall, a united front of quiet determination. The pack parted before them, their whispers a rustling, uneasy sound. It's her. What is she doing back? Look at her, walking like she's a queen. The words that once would have shattered her now felt like pebbles against a stone wall. As they neared the entrance, a familiar figure moved through the crowd. Caleb. He kept his eyes downcast, but he angled his path to intercept theirs, making it look like an accident. He stumbled, bumping into Ava's side. "My apologies, Luna," he murmured, his voice a low, urgent whisper as he steadied her arm. For a fraction of a second, his fingers tightened, a gesture of solidarity. "He's expecting you, but he doesn't know what you know. I'm with you." The contact was over in an instant. He straightened up, bowed his head respectfully to the king, and melted back into the crowd. It was a fleeting exchange, but it was everything. They were not entirely alone. They entered the hall. Marcus was seated on his roughly carved wooden throne, a look of feigned, pleasant surprise on his face. "King Henry, an unexpected honor, and you've brought back our dear Ava," he said, his voice dripping with false charm. "To what do we owe the pleasure?" Henry did not waste time with pleasantries. He walked to the center of the hall, his regal authority silencing the assembled pack members. Ava stood at his shoulder, her gaze locked on the monster who had murdered her mother. "We are not here for pleasantries, Marcus," Henry stated, his voice ringing with kingly power. "We are here on a matter of high treason and murder." He opened the satchel and produced the journal and the note. "We have evidence that you murdered your packmate, a healer named Alara, and that you are conspiring to unearth a forbidden power to challenge the throne." He placed the items on a table for the pack council to see. Marcus did not flinch. He did not rage or deny. He simply looked at the evidence, then at Ava, and a slow, pitying smile spread across his face. The unnerving calm in his eyes was more terrifying than any outburst. Chapter 13. The Serpent's Tongue. Marcus let the silence stretch, a conductor savoring a dramatic pause. Then he chuckled. It was a low, condescending sound that echoed in the tense hall. "This?" he said, gesturing dismissively at the journal. "A grieving woman's private ramblings and a cowardly, unsigned note? This is the great evidence that brings the Alpha King to my doorstep?" He shook his head, a look of profound disappointment on his face. He wasn't addressing Henry. He was speaking to his pack, to his people. He rose from his throne, not with the arrogance of an alpha, but with the pained expression of a betrayed father. He walked down the steps and moved among the assembled wolves, his presence magnetic and reassuring. "Brothers," Sisters, he began, his voice filled with a deep, resonant sorrow. For years I have led you. I have bled with you. We have survived harsh winters and rogue attacks side by side. He placed a hand on the shoulder of an old warrior. Did I not fight beside you when the feral claws tried to take our southern border? He looked at a she-wolf in the front row. Did I not personally find the herbs to save your pup from the river fever? Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. He was reminding them of their shared history, their shared struggles. He was one of them. Henry was an outsider, a foreign king. And now, Marcus continued, his voice thick with emotion, this outsider comes into our home. He stands with a poor, confused girl, a child lost in her own grief, and he uses her pain to make a grab for our land, for our loyalty. His gaze swept over to Ava, and his expression softened into one of deep pity. Poor Ava. We all saw her at her mother's funeral, so lost she could not even cry. Is it any wonder a powerful, charming king could twist her sorrow into a weapon against us? The narrative shifted masterfully. Suddenly, Ava wasn't an accuser. She was a victim, a pawn. The pack's suspicion turned from Marcus to Henry, and their judgment of Ava solidified from disrespect to pity for a broken mind. Ava's eyes darted to Caleb in the crowd. He looked horrified, his face pale. He opened his mouth to speak, to defend her, but at that exact moment, Marcus's gaze swept over him. It was a look that lasted only a second, but it was filled with a promise of such chilling, absolute violence that Caleb flinched and fell silent, his eyes dropping to the floor. He was neutralized. They were completely alone. Their plan, so carefully constructed, had spectacularly imploded. The pack, which had been wary just moments before, now glared at Henry and Ava with open hostility. Henry stood tall, his regal authority rendered useless against Marcus's intimate, masterful manipulation. They had lost. There was nothing more to say. As they turned to leave, defeated, Marcus's voice boomed across the hall, a clap of thunder that stopped them dead in their tracks. "You came here accusing me of seeking power, Your Majesty," he roared, his benevolent mask finally falling away to reveal the monster beneath. He smiled, a wide, triumphant, and terrifying expression. "You came looking for a show, so allow me to give you one. Now, you will all see my true power." Chapter 14. The Shadowstone. A hush fell over the great hall, thick with confusion and a dark, hungry curiosity. Marcus's boast hung in the air, a promise of something terrible and great. With a theatrical flourish, he reached behind his throne, his hand disappearing into a hidden recess. When he pulled it out, he was holding a rock. But it was like no rock Ava had ever seen. It was a chunk of obsidian so black it seemed to drink the torchlight from the room. It wasn't smooth. It was jagged and cruel-looking, and deep within its core, a vein of sickly, violet light pulsed with a slow, nauseating rhythm, like a diseased heart. The air grew cold. A wave of profound wrongness washed over Ava, a feeling of ancient sickness and corrupted life. "The legends are true," Marcus gloated, holding the stone aloft for all to see. The purple light cast dancing, grotesque shadows on his face. While the sacred luna tree represents the light of the goddess, a passive, gentle magic, it has a twin, a shadow brother, born of the same ancient earth, but nurtured in darkness. He paced before the stunned crowd, his voice filled with the fervor of a mad prophet. "This is the Shadowstone, and it does not wait to choose a leader. It empowers the one strong enough to take what is his." His words were poison, seeping into the ears of his pack, twisting their values, offering them a shortcut to a power they had never dreamed of. Ava felt Henry stiffen beside her, his body thrumming with a mixture of shock and dawning horror. This was a relic of forbidden lore, a nightmare they thought was only a story to scare pups. "The stone has a wonderful quality," Marcus continued, his eyes glittering with malice. "It feeds on power. It can drain the alpha strength from one wolf and transfer it to another. his meaning was brutally clear. He was going to strip Henry of his Alpha King status and take the power for himself, becoming an unstoppable tyrant. The ambition radiating from him was a tangible, stinking cloud. Then, his gaze swept through the crowd and landed with chilling precision on Caleb. The young warrior, who had been trying to shrink into the background, froze like a deer in a hunter's sights. Marcus smiled, a slow, cruel curving of his lips. "It also has a taste for weakness," he purred, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that everyone could hear. "It loves the taste of betrayal. It makes a wonderfully effective tool for ensuring loyalty, don't you think?" The threat was no longer a hint or a dark look. It was a public death sentence. Caleb's face went ashen with terror. Henry took a protective step forward, a low growl rumbling in his chest, his duty as king overriding his shock. But Marcus was a step ahead. He was no longer just a corrupt alpha. With that stone in his hand, he was something far, far worse. Chapter 15. The Healer's Betrayal. Before Henry could cross the floor, two of Marcus's biggest warriors moved with startling speed. They grabbed Caleb, yanking him from the crowd and dragging him forward. He struggled, his eyes wide with panic, but he was hopelessly outmatched. They forced him to his knees before Marcus, a sacrifice presented at a dark altar. The shadow stone pulsed eagerly in Marcus's hand, its vile purple light bathing Caleb in a glow of imminent doom. The hall was a tinderbox of fear and violence ready to explode. Henry prepared to lunge, to meet this brutality with his own royal fury. But before the first blow could be struck, a new voice cut through the tension like a shard of ice. "This is your fault." The voice belonged to Lyra. The silver-haired healer from Henry's own pack stepped forward, her face a mask of cold, righteous fury. She wasn't looking at Marcus. She was pointing a trembling, accusatory finger directly at her king. A wave of stunned silence washed over the hall. Ava stared, bewildered. Lyra was Henry's healer, his advisor. She was supposed to be on their side. "All of this darkness, it is a plague you have brought upon us." Lyra's voice rang with unshakable conviction. She addressed not just Henry, but everyone present, Marcus's pack and the small contingent of Golden Heart warriors who had accompanied their king. "Our world is balanced. The power of the Alpha King is a sacred trust, a divine right. When that trust is broken, when the throne is occupied by a fraudulent king, the balance is shattered." Ava felt Henry flinch beside her as if he'd been physically struck. Fraudulent king, his deepest, most secret shame, now wielded as a public weapon against him. "A lie on the throne weakens the very fabric of our magic," Lyra continued, her voice rising with zealous passion. "It creates cracks in the foundation of our world, and through those cracks, ancient evils like the Shadowstone are allowed to fester and rise again. Your lie, Henry, invited this darkness in. Your weakness is the reason we are all in peril." It was a masterful, devastating blow. Lyra's words struck Henry's deepest fear and his crushing guilt, validating every doubt he had ever had about himself. Ava could feel the shock and shame pouring off him in waves. His alpha presence, which had been a roaring fire just moments before, sputtered and shrank. He looked at Lyra, then at the horrified faces of his own warriors, and the strength seemed to drain out of him. He was exposed. He was the cause of all this. And in his heart, he believed it. Marcus let out a booming laugh, his voice dripping with triumph. "You see? Even your own pack knows the truth. You are a king of lies, and your reign is a blight." He reveled in Henry's psychological collapse, his victory now absolute. He held the terrified Caleb by the scruff of his neck, but his true hostage was Henry's soul. With a final, victorious sneer, Marcus raised the Shadowstone, its vile energy coiling in the air. He aimed it directly at the faltering, broken king. "Now," he hissed, "let's burn away the lie and see what little is left of the man." Chapter 16. The Resignation of a King. The air crackled. A thick, visible tendril of violet energy like purple smoke lashed out from the shadow stone and wrapped around Henry. He cried out, not in pain, but in a gasp of spiritual agony. Ava watched in horror as the corrupting magic coiled around him. It wasn't a physical attack, it was an invasion. The dark energy wasn't breaking his body, it was devouring his will. She could feel what he was feeling, a sensation of being hollowed out, of his strength, his very essence being siphoned away into the greedy, pulsing heart of the stone. But it was worse than that. The stone wasn't just taking his power, it was feeding on his guilt. Every fear he had ever had, every moment of doubt, every ounce of shame over his brother's death and his fraudulent claim to the throne, the stone amplified it all. Lyra's words echoed in the space between them, a verdict delivered by his own people. Your fault, your lie, your weakness. In his mind, he was no longer a king fighting a tyrant. He was a criminal, finally receiving his long-overdue punishment. He felt he deserved this. This was justice for his sins. Ava saw the fight leave him. His shoulders, which had been tense and ready for battle, slumped in resignation. The golden fire in his eyes, the symbol of his alpha power and his very life force, began to dim, fading to a dull, muted bronze. He lowered his head. He was accepting his fate. He was giving up. Marcus's laughter echoed in the hall, a triumphant, ugly sound. He was winning. He had captured Caleb. He had turned their allies against them. And now he was destroying the man Ava had just started to build a future with, right before her eyes. This was it, the lowest point, the moment where all hope dies. Despair, cold and absolute, washed over Ava. Everything was lost. Henry, the powerful king who had swept into her life and promised a new beginning, had surrendered to his own demons. The world was about to fall into the hands of a monster, and there was nothing she could do. She was just the quiet girl, the broken container, the powerless Luna. But as she watched the last spark of light fade from Henry's eyes, something inside her broke. A lifetime of passivity, of absorbing the pain of others and holding it in silence, shattered into a million pieces. And in its place, something new and terrifyingly powerful ignited. It was a rage so pure and white-hot, it burned away her despair. It was a fierce, primal love for the broken man on his knees. It was the furious spirit of her murdered mother demanding justice. She had been a dam for her entire life, holding back floods of emotion. But the dam had just broken. If the king wouldn't fight, then she would. In the dead silence of the hall, as Marcus gloated and Henry faded, Ava took a single deliberate step forward. Her face, once a mask of stoic blankness, was now a vision of chilling, absolute resolve. Chapter 17. The emptiness that holds Ava's single step forward changed the gravity of the room. Every eye, shocked, pitying, and cruel, snapped to her. Marcus let out a short, barking laugh of disbelief. Henry looked up from the floor, his dull, defeated eyes barely registering her movement. In that moment, as she faced the pulsing violet evil of the Shadowstone, a profound clarity washed over her. She looked at the stone, and for the first time, she truly saw it. It was not just an object of dark power. It was a container, just like her. It was filled to bursting with a chaotic storm of pure negative emotion, eons of greed, rage, jealousy, and pain. It was the shriek of a terrified pup, the grief of 1,000 funerals all magnified into a weapon, and she, in a way no one else could, understood it. Her entire life she had been a vessel. She had been taught to build walls, to contain the pain, to hold it. But that was a mistake. A container can break. A dam can overflow. In a flash of brilliant, world-altering insight, she realized what she truly was. She was not a container. She was a void, an absolute, perfect emptiness. She didn't just hold pain. Her gift, her curse, was to unmake it, to provide a silence so complete that even the loudest screams of chaos simply ceased to be. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud. It was a quiet, clear sound that cut through the tension with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "You are wrong about power, Marcus," she said, her eyes fixed on the gloating alpha. "It isn't about what you can take. It is about what you can bear." Her gaze shifted to the Shadowstone, and she felt no fear, only a strange, calm sense of purpose. "And I," she stated, "can bear that. Give its power to me." The sheer audacity of her challenge stunned the room into silence. Marcus's sneer faltered. He had expected tears, begging, a pathetic end. He had not expected this quiet, unbreakable defiance. From across the room, Lyra stared, her icy composure finally cracking. She looked from Ava's face, a portrait of serene courage, to Henry's broken form on the floor. In that instant, the healer saw the catastrophic nature of her mistake. She had condemned the wrong monarch. She had betrayed the wrong heart. Scrambling across the floor, Lyra fell to her knees beside the nearly catatonic Henry. She grabbed his arm, her voice a desperate, urgent whisper against his ear. "My king, you must listen. I was wrong. So wrong." Her eyes were wide with a dawning, terrified hope. "It is a piece of ancient lore, a prophecy I thought was a myth. A pure heart can contain the darkness, but only a shared heart can release it." Her grip tightened on his arm, trying to pull him back from the brink of his despair. "She can absorb it, but she cannot defeat it alone. The bond, the one the goddess marked you with, it is the key. You have to help her. You are the only one who can." Henry slowly lifted his head. He looked from Lyra's desperate face to Ava, who now stood alone in the center of the hall, a small gray rock ready to absorb the force of a tidal wave. A tiny flicker of the old golden light, of hope, returned to his dimming eyes. Chapter 18. A Shared Heart. "You?" Marcus finally roared, his shock giving way to derisive laughter. "It will tear your pathetic, empty soul to pieces, girl." He was ecstatic. This was better than he could have planned. Not only would he drain the king, but he would shatter the goddess's chosen Luna as a final act of blasphemy. He held the stone out as if in offering. "By all means, come and claim your prize." Ava ignored him. His voice was just meaningless noise now. She closed her eyes, shutting out the gawking faces of the pack, the cold stone of the hall, the pulsing violet light of the stone. She needed to find her center. For years, she had practiced closing herself off, building walls to keep the emotions of others out. Now she did the opposite. She methodically dismantled every wall, every defense. She opened herself completely, embracing the core of her being, the quiet, peaceful, absolute emptiness. She was not a shield. She was the space behind the shield, a perfect, silent void. She anchored herself with memories, the scent of her mother's lavender sachets, the feeling of Caleb's brief, loyal touch, the raw, broken honesty in Henry's voice as he confessed his deepest secret. These were not walls, but tethers, reminders of the world she was fighting to protect. She was ready. As she stood there, a pillar of impossible calm in a storm of tension, a presence settled beside her. She opened her eyes. It was Henry. He had struggled to his feet, the last vestiges of the stone's draining influence clinging to him like smoke. But his back was straight. Lyra's words had given him more than hope. They had given him a new purpose. He was not the fraudulent king who had to be strong enough to bear the crown alone. He was the man who had shared his deepest weakness with the woman beside him. He understood now. True strength wasn't his title. It was their bond. He stood shoulder to shoulder with her, a solid, unwavering wall of support. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply looked down at her, and his golden eyes, now clearing and bright with a fierce, protective fire, said everything. They were full of awe, of regret, and of a love so profound it was a physical force. He was no longer a king offering protection to a subject. He was a partner ready to face oblivion with his equal. In a voice meant only for her, a quiet promise that remade their world, he said, "We will do this together." The words sealed the final crack in her resolve. A surge of strength, of pure, unadulterated hope flooded through her. They were not two broken people anymore. They were two halves of a single, shared heart, a complete and unbreakable unit. Taking one last, deep breath, Ava turned away from Henry's supportive gaze. She faced Marcus and the pulsing, malignant evil of the Shadowstone, and with steady, fearless steps, she walked forward to meet her destiny. Chapter 19. The Joining of Burdens. Her steps were silent on the cold stone floor. The hall held its breath. Marcus watched her approach with a hungry, predatory grin, holding the Shadowstone out like a venomous serpent ready to strike. Ava stopped just before him. The violet light of the stone bathed her face in a sickly glow, but her expression remained one of serene calm. She raised a hand, her fingers trembling almost imperceptibly, and reached for the stone. The moment her skin made contact with its jagged, icy surface, the world exploded. A universe of pain and chaos slammed into her. It was not a feeling. It was a physical invasion, a tidal wave of pure, distilled evil that crashed through every part of her being. It was the rage of every murder, the greed of every thief, the despair of every lost soul trapped within the stone for 1,000 years. It was a soundless scream that threatened to tear her mind apart. Her body convulsed, a ragged gasp torn from her lips as the sheer, overwhelming force of it brought her to her knees. Dark, violet energy, visible as writhing tendrils of shadow, swirled around her, consuming her. "Yes!" Marcus screamed, his face alight with ecstatic madness. "Feel it! Feel the history of true power! Let it scour you from the inside out!" He was witnessing the destruction he craved, the unmaking of a pure soul. He thought he was watching her die. From across the room, Henry saw her face contort in an agony beyond all description. He saw her body trembling, her knuckles white where she clutched the stone, fighting to contain a storm that would shatter a mountain. Lyra's words screamed in his mind. A pure heart can contain the darkness, but only a shared heart can release it. He knew, with absolute certainty, that he could not let her bear this alone. To do so would be the ultimate failure, a betrayal far worse than his claim to the throne. He didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, closing the distance in 2 powerful strides. He ignored Marcus's shocked shout, his eyes fixed only on Ava. She was losing, her essence being eroded by the sheer volume of the darkness. He fell to his knees beside her and grabbed her free hand, his fingers lacing through hers, a desperate, solid grip. "I'm with you, Ava," he yelled, his voice a raw cry against the roaring chaos. "I'm right here." He closed his eyes, focusing every ounce of his will not on fighting the darkness, but on the bond between them. The mark of the goddess, the shared secret in the armory, the promise he had just made. He opened his soul to her, a silent offering, a plea to share her burden. A jolt, as if from a lightning strike, passed between them. A thick, writhing tendril of the violet energy, which had been pouring solely into Ava, diverted its path. It snaked up her arm, across their joined hands, and slammed into Henry. He roared in pain as the corrupting force flooded him, a vile, chilling energy that sought out his own fears and regrets. But he held fast. He gritted his teeth, his body shuddering with the strain, and took on the pain. The torrent of evil was no longer battering a single, lonely rock. It was crashing against a foundation of 2 hearts, bound together as one. The burden was now shared. Chapter 20. The Unmaking of Shadow. The pain was a living entity, a shrieking storm of pure malice that raged through both of their bodies. But it was a shared storm. With Henry's hand locked in hers, Ava was no longer a lone fortress being battered by the sea. She was one half of a bedrock foundation. The violent, corrupting energy that poured from the Shadowstone still flooded into her, but now it had somewhere to go. Anchored by Henry's strength, she did not just contain the darkness. She did what she was born to do. She unmade it. Inside the perfect, peaceful void of her soul, the ancient rage of the stone was nullified. The eons of greed were silenced. The despair was turned to dust. What flowed from her into Henry was not the Shadowstone's vile corruption, but a clean, calm emptiness. It was a wave of pure peace that washed away the dregs of his own guilt and fear, filling him with a strength he had never known. He, in turn, became an anchor for her, his steadfast presence allowing her to process the torrent of evil at an impossible speed. They were a circuit, a living engine of purification. The violet energy poured into her, was unmade within her, and flowed into him as peace, which he then reflected back to her as unbreakable support. They felt the exact moment the stone was emptied. The raging torrent of power dwindled to a trickle, and then stopped. All of its ancient darkness was gone from the world, held safely within their shared bond. They opened their eyes, looking at each other. A silent, perfect understanding passed between them. It was time. Slowly, together, they rose to their feet, their hands still clasped, their bodies humming with a contained power that was neither light nor dark. Marcus stared, his face a mask of confusion. The stone in his hand was now just a dull, inert piece of black rock. What did you do?" he stammered. Ava and Henry didn't answer. They simply stood together, and with a shared breath, they released the energy they held. It did not erupt as a weapon. It bloomed. A blinding, silent flash of pure, silvery white light expanded from them, the exact same light as the petal from the sacred Luna tree. It was not a violent blast, but a gentle, cleansing wave. It washed over everyone in the hall, not burning, but healing. It swept through the open doors, across the midnight moon packlands, making the grass greener, the air cleaner, and the world feel, for a moment, perfectly new. When the light faded, Marcus was blinking stupidly, his only source of power gone. He was just a wolf again, a cruel, ambitious wolf, but nothing more. Henry released Ava's hand. He was no longer the broken man who had knelt on the floor. He was the Alpha King, filled not with a fraudulent title, but with a true, earned, and righteous power. He moved in a silent, golden blur. The fight was an insult to the word. It was an execution. Henry disarmed the powerless, sputtering Marcus with a single contemptuous strike that sent him sprawling to the floor. As Marcus fell, the now dull Shadowstone slipped from his grasp. It hit the stone floor with a faint tink, and then, with a sound like cracking ice, it disintegrated into 1,000 shards of lifeless black dust, which were then swept away by a gentle breeze. Chapter 21. The Healing of Wounds. In the aftermath, the great hall was utterly still, bathed in the soft, peaceful afterglow of the purification. The wolves of the Midnight Moon Pack, who had been ready to defend their corrupt alpha moments before, now stared at Ava and Henry with a mixture of profound awe and deep, humbling shame. They had been blind, and now they could see. Henry's warriors, their faces grim, moved forward and seized the pathetic, whimpering Marcus, binding his hands. The tyrant's reign was over. Henry did not spare his defeated enemy another glance. His first act as a true, undisputed king was one of justice and grace. He walked directly to Caleb, who was still kneeling, stunned, in the center of the room. Henry knelt and personally cut the young warrior's bonds with his own dagger. He pulled Caleb to his feet, placing a firm, steadying hand on his shoulder. In a voice that rang with quiet authority, Henry addressed the entire hall. "Let it be known," he declared, his gaze sweeping over the shamed faces of the Midnight Moon Pack, "that the crown honors the courage and loyalty of Caleb. He risked everything for the truth. He is a friend to his king and a hero to all packs." He gave Caleb's shoulder a final, appreciative squeeze. The young wolf looked up, his eyes shining with tears of relief and gratitude. In a single moment, his name was cleared, and his bravery was etched into the history of his pack. As Henry stepped back, another figure moved forward. It was Lyra. Her silver hair was disheveled, her face pale and streaked with tears. The icy, proud healer was gone, replaced by a woman humbled to her very core. She walked past Henry and stopped before Ava. Then, to the astonishment of everyone, she sank gracefully to her knees, bowing her head so low her forehead almost touched the stone floor. "Luna," she whispered, her voice thick and choked with emotion. "I was a fool. I was so blinded by my loyalty to the past, to the memory of Liam, and by the letter of the law that I could not see the truth of the heart." She looked up, and her pale eyes, once so cold, were now filled with a deep, sincere remorse. "I saw a king I believed to be a fraud, and I called it a weakness that would bring darkness, but I was wrong." Her gaze was full of wonder as she looked at Ava. A true bond is not about a perfect claim to power. It is about a shared heart, a love strong enough to stand against the dark and heal it. "You saved us all, not with strength, but with a burden you chose to carry." Her voice broke. "Can you ever forgive me?" Ava looked down at the kneeling healer. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a deep, quiet empathy. She reached down, her hands gentle, and took Lyra's arms, urging her to rise. "There is nothing to forgive, Lyra," Ava said, her voice soft but firm. "We were all broken in our own way. Today is the day we start to heal." For Chapter 22. The glow of a new dawn months passed, and the seasons turned. The harsh memory of the Shadowstone faded, replaced by a peace so deep and profound, it felt as if the world itself had taken a cleansing breath. Under the joint leadership of Ava and Henry, the Golden Heart Pack thrived, becoming a beacon of a new kind of strength, one built not on dominance but on unity and empathy. Ava was transformed. The blank, stoic mask she had worn for a lifetime was gone, replaced by a serene, open kindness. She was no longer a silent ghost in the halls. She was the heart of the pack. She was often seen walking the grounds, speaking with pack members, her smile gentle and genuine. Her gift, once a terrible curse, was now a tool of compassion she controlled completely. She could reach out and soothe the scraped knee of a crying pup, or sit with an elder and quietly absorb a portion of their lonely sorrow, taking the edge off their pain. The burdens she took were no longer hers to carry alone. In quiet moments, she and Henry would join hands, and the small pains she had collected would be unmade in the peaceful void between their shared hearts. Henry, too, was a different king. The haunted, insecure man who had hidden behind a crown was gone. He led with a quiet, unshakable confidence that came not from a title, but from the truth of his own story. He openly spoke of his brother Liam, not with guilt, but with love and reverence. He had found his strength not by pretending to be perfect, but by embracing his own vulnerability and allowing it to be his connection to his people. He and Ava were a true partnership, their individual strengths and weaknesses woven together to create a leadership of perfect balance. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of rose and violet, Ava stood on her favorite balcony, looking out over the peaceful valley. She felt a profound sense of rightness, a feeling of being exactly where she was meant to be. She smiled, a soft, genuine expression of pure contentment, thinking of Henry in his study below, of the family they were building, of the home she had finally found. Her gaze drifted east, towards the distant mountains that sheltered her old pack. And there, on the horizon, she saw it. A tiny, impossibly bright pinprick of light. Miles and miles away, rising above the dark canopy of the forest, the sacred Luna tree was glowing. It wasn't the gentle, intermittent pulse of before. It was a brilliant, steady, and vibrant silvery white beacon, a constant and powerful source of light in the growing darkness. It was a reflection of the purity they had unleashed, a promise of the enduring peace they had fought for. The world was healed. And so, finally, was she.